Mysteries of Udolpho by Ann Radcliffe. Hello, this is Kara from Reading Rest Period. Before I continue with the chapter today, I'd just like to take a moment to remind you, if you're enjoying this, you can help support this project, this long labor of love, by making a donation directly to paypal.me/Kara Dahl Russell. And a shout out to Jillian B., who did just that and made a generous donation. Thank you for that. And to any of you, I'm grateful for any amount that comes my way to pay for a portion of my time and doing this long labor of love. Thank you so much, and I'm glad you're enjoying it. Volume 3, Chapter 9. Quote, "Thus, on the chill Laponian's dreary land, for many a long month lost in snow profound, when Sol from Cancer sends the season bland, and in their northern cave the storms half bound, from silent mountains, straight, with startling sound, torrents are hurled, green hills emerge, and lo, the trees with foliage, cliffs with flowers are crowned. Pure rills through vales of verdure warbling go, and wonder, love, and joy the peasant's heart o'erflow." End quote. Beatty. Several of her succeeding days passed in suspense, for Ludovico could only learn from the soldiers that there was a prisoner in the apartment, and that he was a Frenchman, whom they had taken in one of their skirmishes with a party of his countrymen. During this interval, Emily escaped the persecutions of Bertolini and Veresi by confining herself to her apartment, except that sometimes, in an evening, she ventured to walk in the adjoining corridor. Montoni appeared to respect his last promise, though he had profaned his first, for to his protection only could she attribute her present repose, and in this she was now so secure that she did not wish to leave the castle till she could obtain some certainty concerning Valancourt, for which she waited, indeed, without any sacrifice of her own comfort, since no circumstance had occurred to make her escape probable. On the fourth day, Ludovico informed her that he had hopes of being admitted to the presence of the prisoner, it being the turn of a soldier with whom he had been for some time familiar to attend him on the following night. He was not deceived in his hope, for, under pretense of carrying in a pitcher of water, he entered the prison, though his prudence having prevented him from telling the sentinel the real motive of his visit, he was obliged to make his conference with the prisoner a very short one. Emily awaited the result in her own apartment, Ludovico having promised to accompany Annette to the corridor in the evening, where, after several hours impatiently counted, he arrived. Emily, having then uttered the name of Valancourt, could articulate no more, but hesitated in trembling expectation. "The Chevalier would not entrust me with his name, Signora," replied Ludovico. "But when I just mentioned yours, he seemed overwhelmed with joy, though he was not so much surprised as I expected." "Does he then remember me?" she exclaimed. "Oh, it is Monsieur Valancourt," said Annette, and looked impatiently at Ludovico, who understood her look, and replied to Emily, "Yes, lady, the Chevalier does indeed remember you, and I am sure he has a very great regard for you, and I made bold to say you had for him. He then inquired how you came to know he was in the castle, and whether you ordered me to speak to him. The first question I could not answer, but the second I did, and then he went off into his ecstasies again. I was afraid his joy would have betrayed him to the sentinel at the door." "But how does he look, Ludovico?" interrupted Emily. "Is he not melancholy and ill with his long confinement?" "Why, as to melancholy, I saw no symptom of that, lady, while I was with him, for he seemed in the finest spirits I ever saw anybody in all my life. His countenance was all joy, and, if one may judge from that, he was very well, but I did not ask him." "Did he send me no message?" said Emily. "Oh yes, Signora, and something besides," replied Ludovico, who searched his pockets. "Surely I have not lost it," added he. "The Chevalier said he would have written, madame, if he had pen and ink, and was going to have sent a very long message when the sentinel entered the room, but not before he had give me this." Ludovico then drew forth a miniature from his bosom, which Emily received with a trembling hand, and perceived to be a portrait of herself, the very picture which her mother had lost so strangely in the fishing house at La Vallée. Tears of mingled joy and tenderness flowed to her eyes while Ludovico proceeded. "Tell your lady," said the Chevalier as he gave me this picture, "that this has been my companion and only solace in all my misfortunes. Tell her that I have worn it next to my heart, and that I send it her as a pledge of affection which can never die, that I would not part with it but to her for the wealth of worlds, and that I now part with it only in the hope of soon receiving it from her hands. Tell her—" Just then, Signora, the sentinel came in, and the Chevalier said no more, but he had before asked me to contrive an interview for him with you, and when I told him how little hope I had of prevailing with the guard to assist me, he said that was not, perhaps, of so much consequence as I imagined, and bade me contrive to bring back your answer, and he would inform me of more than he chose to do then. So this, I think, lady, is, yes, the whole of what passed." "How, Ludovico, shall I reward you for your zeal?" said Emily. "But indeed I do not now possess the means. When can you see the Chevalier again?" "That is uncertain, Signora," replied he. "It depends upon who stands guard next. There are not more than one or two among them from whom I would dare to ask admittance to the prison chamber." "I need not bid you to remember, Ludovico," resumed Emily, "how very much interested I am in your seeing the Chevalier soon, and when you do, tell him that I have received the picture, and with the sentiments he wished. Tell him I have suffered much, and still suffer." She paused. "But shall I tell him you will see him, lady?" said Ludovico. "Most certainly I will," replied Emily. "But when, Signora, and where?" "That must depend upon circumstances," returned Emily. "The place and the hour must be regulated by his opportunities." "Oh, as to the place, mademoiselle," said Annette, "there is no other place in the castle besides this corridor where we can see him in safety, you know. And as for the hour, it must be when all the signors are asleep, if that ever happens." "You may mention these circumstances to the Chevalier, Ludovico," said she, checking the flippancy of Annette, "and leave them to his judgment and opportunity. Tell him my heart is unchanged, but above all, let him see you again as soon as possible, and, Ludovico, I think it is needless to tell you that I shall very anxiously look for you." Having then wished her good night, Ludovico descended the staircase, and Emily retired to rest, but not to sleep, for joy now rendered her as wakeful as she had ever been from grief. Montoni and his castle had all but vanished from her mind like the frightful vision of a necromancer, and she wandered once more in fairy scenes of unfading happiness. Quote, "As when, beneath the beam of summer moons, the distant woods among, or by some flood, all silvered with the gleam, the soft embodied phrase, through airy portals stream." End quote. A week elapsed before Ludovico again visited the prison, for the sentinels during that period were men in whom he could not confide, and he feared to awaken curiosity by asking to see the prisoner. In this interval he communicated to Emily terrific reports of what was passing in the castle, of riots, quarrels, and of carousals more alarming than either, while from some circumstances which he mentioned, she not only doubted whether Montoni meant ever to release her, but greatly feared that he had designs concerning her, such as she had formerly dreaded. Her name was frequently mentioned in the conversations which Bertolini and Verezzi held together, and at those times they were frequently in contention. Montoni had lost large sums to Verezzi, so that there was a dreadful possibility of his designing her to be a substitute for the debt. But as she was ignorant that he had formerly encouraged the hopes of Bertolini also concerning herself, after the latter had done him some signal service, she knew not how to account for these contentions between Bertolini and Verezzi. The cause of them, however, appeared to be of little consequence, for she thought she saw destruction approaching in many forms, and her entreaties to Ludovico to contrive an escape and to see the prisoner again were more urgent than ever. At length he informed her that he had again visited the Chevalier, who had directed him to confide in the guard of the prison, from whom he had already received some instances of kindness, and who had promised to permit his going into the castle for half an hour on the ensuing night, when Montoni and his companions should be engaged at their carousals. "This was kind, to be sure," added Ludovico, "but Sebastian knows he runs no risk in letting the Chevalier out, for, if he can get beyond the bars and iron doors of the castle, he must be cunning indeed. But the Chevalier desired me, Signora, to go to you immediately, and to beg you would allow him to visit you this night, if it was only for a moment, for that he could no longer live under the same roof without seeing you. The hour, he said, he could not mention, for it must depend on circumstances, just as you said, Signora, and the place he desired you would appoint, as knowing which was best for your own safety." Emily was now so much agitated by the near prospect of meeting Valancourt that it was some time before she could give any answer to Ludovico, or consider the place of meeting. When she did, she saw none that promised so much security as the corridor near her own apartment, which she was checked from leaving by the apprehension of meeting any of Montoni's guests on their way to their rooms. And she dismissed the scruples which delicacy opposed, now that a serious danger was to be avoided by encountering them. It was settled, therefore, that the Chevalier should meet her in the corridor, at that hour of the night which Ludovico, who was to be upon the watch, should judge safest. And Emily, as may be imagined, passed this interval in a tumult of hope and joy, anxiety and impatience. Never since her residence in the castle had she watched with so much pleasure the sun set behind the mountains, and twilight shade, and darkness veil the scene as on this evening. She counted the notes of the great clock, and listened to the steps of the sentinels as they changed the watch, only to rejoice that another hour was gone. "Oh, Valancourt," said she, "after all I have suffered, after our long, long separation, when I thought I should never, never see you more, we are still to meet again. Oh, I have endured grief and anxiety and terror, and let me then not sink beneath this joy." These were moments when it was impossible for her to feel emotions of regret or melancholy for any ordinary interests. Even the reflection that she had resigned the estates, which would have been a provision for herself and Valancourt for life, threw only a light and transient shade upon her spirits. The idea of Valancourt, and that she should see him so soon, alone occupied her heart. At length the clock struck 12. She opened the door to listen if any noise was in the castle, and heard only distant shouts of riot and laughter, echoed feebly along the gallery. She guessed that the Signor and his guests were at the banquet. "They are now engaged for the night," said she, "and Valancourt will soon be here." Having softly closed the door, she paced the room with impatient steps, and often went to the casement to listen for the lute, but all was silent, and, her agitation every moment increasing, she was at length unable to support herself, and sat down by the window. Annette, whom she detained, was in the meantime as loquacious as usual, but Emily heard scarcely anything she said, and having at length risen to the casement, she distinguished the chords of the lute, struck with an expressive hand, and then the voice she had formerly listened to accompanied it. Quote, "Now rising love they fanned, now pleasing dole they breathed in tender musings through the heart, and now a graver, sacred strain they stole, as when seraphic hands a hymn impart." End quote. Emily wept in doubtful joy and tenderness, and, when the strain ceased, she considered it as a signal that Valancourt was about to leave the prison. Soon after she heard steps in the corridor. They were the light, quick steps of hope. She could scarcely support herself as they approached, but opening the door of the apartment, she advanced to meet Valancourt, and, in the next moment, sunk in the arms of a stranger. His voice, his countenance, instantly convinced her, and she fainted away. On reviving, she found herself supported by the stranger, who was watching over her recovery with a countenance of ineffable tenderness and anxiety. She had no spirits for reply or enquiry. She asked no questions, but burst into tears and disengaged herself from his arms. When the expression of his countenance changed to surprise and disappointment, and he turned to Ludovico for an explanation, Annette soon gave the information which Ludovico could not. "Oh, sir," said she, in a voice interrupted with sobs. "Oh, sir, you are not the other chevalier. We expected Monsieur Valancourt, but you are not he. Oh, Ludovico, how could you deceive us so? My poor lady will never recover it, never." The stranger, who now appeared much agitated, attempted to speak, but his words faltered, and then striking his hand against his forehead, as if in sudden despair, he walked abruptly to the other end of the corridor. Suddenly Annette dried her tears and spoke to Ludovico. "But perhaps," said she, "after all, the other chevalier is not this. Perhaps the Chevalier Valancourt is still below." Emily raised her head. "No," replied Ludovico, "Monsieur Valancourt never was below, if this gentleman is not he." "If you, sir," said Ludovico, addressing the stranger, "would but have the goodness to trust me with your name, this mistake could have been avoided." "Most true," replied the stranger, speaking in broken Italian, "but it was of the utmost consequence to me that my name should be concealed from Montoni. Madame," added he, then, addressing Emily in French, "will you permit me to apologize for the pain I have occasioned you, and to explain to you alone my name, and the circumstance which has led me into this error? I am of France. I am your countryman. We are met in a foreign land." Emily tried to compose her spirits, yet she hesitated to grant his request. At length, desiring that Ludovico would wait on the staircase, and detaining Annette, she told the stranger that her woman understood very little Italian, and begged he would communicate what he wished to say in that language. Having withdrawn to a distant part of the corridor, he said, with a long-drawn sigh, "You, madame, are no stranger to me, though I am so unhappy as to be unknown to you. My name is Dupont. I am of France, of Gascony, your native province, and have long admired, and why should I affect to disguise it, have long loved you." He paused, but in the next moment proceeded. "My family, madame, is probably not unknown to you, for we lived within a few miles of La Vallée, and I have sometimes had the happiness of meeting you on visits in the neighborhood. I will not offend you by repeating how much you interested me, how much I loved to wander in the scenes you frequented, how often I visited your favorite fishing house, and lamented the circumstance which, at that time, forbade me to reveal my passion. I will not explain how I surrendered to temptation and became possessed of a treasure which was to me inestimable, a treasure which I committed to your messenger a few days ago with expectations very different from my present ones. I will say nothing of these circumstances, for I know they will avail me little. Let me only supplicate from you forgiveness and the picture which I so unwarily returned. Your generosity will pardon the theft and restore the prize. My crime has been my punishment, for the portrait I stole has contributed to nourish a passion which must still be my torment." Emily now interrupted him. "I think, sir, I may leave it to your integrity to determine whether, after what has just appeared concerning Monsieur Valancourt, I ought to return the picture. I think you will acknowledge that this would not be generosity, and you will allow me to add that it would be doing myself an injustice. I must consider myself honored by your good opinion, but the mistake of this evening makes it unnecessary for me to say more." "It does, madame. Alas, it does," said the stranger, who after a long pause proceeded, "But you will allow me to show my disinterestedness, though not my love, and will accept the services I offer. Yet, alas, what services can I offer? I am myself a prisoner, a sufferer like you, but dear as liberty is to me, I would not seek it through half the hazards I would encounter to deliver you from this recess of vice. Accept the offered services of a friend. Do not refuse me the reward of having at least attempted to deserve your thanks." "You deserve them already, sir," said Emily. "The wish deserves my warmest thanks. But you will excuse me for reminding you of the danger you incur by prolonging this interview. It will be a great consolation to me to remember, whether your friendly attempts to release me succeed or not, that I have a countryman who would so generously protect me." Monsieur Dupont took her hand, which she but feebly attempted to withdraw, and pressed it respectfully to his lips. "Allow me to breathe another fervent sigh for your happiness," said he, "and to applaud myself for an affection which I cannot conquer." As he said this, Emily heard a noise from her apartment, and turning round, saw the door from the staircase open, and a man rush into her chamber. "I will teach you to conquer it," cried he, as he advanced into the corridor and drew a stiletto, which he aimed at Dupont, who was unarmed, but who, stepping back, avoided the blow, and then sprung upon Verezzi, from whom he wrenched the stiletto. While they struggled in each other's grasp, Emily, followed by Annette, ran further into the corridor, calling on Ludovico, who was, however, gone from the staircase. And as she advanced, terrified and uncertain of what to do, a distant noise that seemed to arise from the hall reminded her of the danger she was incurring, and sending Annette forward in search of Ludovico, she returned to the spot where Dupont and Verezzi were still struggling for victory. It was her own cause which was to be decided with that of the former, whose conduct, independently of this circumstance, would, however, have interested her in his success, even had she not disliked and dreaded Verezzi. She threw herself in a chair, and supplicated them to desist from further violence till, at length, Dupont forced Verezzi to the floor, where he lay stunned by the violence of his fall, and she then entreated Dupont to escape from the room before Montoni or his party could appear. But he still refused to leave her unprotected, and, while Emily, now more terrified for him than for herself, enforced the entreaty, they heard steps ascending the private staircase. "Oh, you are lost!" cried she. "These are Montoni's people." Dupont made no reply, but supported Emily while, with a steady though eager countenance, he awaited their appearance, and in the next moment Ludovico alone mounted the landing-place, throwing a hasty glance round the chamber. "Follow me," said he. "As you value your lives, we have not an instant to lose." Emily inquired what had occurred, and whither they were to go. "I cannot stay to tell you now, Signora," replied Ludovico. "Fly! Fly!" She immediately followed him, accompanied by Monsieur Dupont, down the staircase, and along a vaulted passage, when suddenly she recollected Annette, and inquired for her. "She awaits us further on, Signora," said Ludovico, almost breathless with haste. "The gates were open, a moment since, to a party just come in from the mountains. They will be shut, I fear, before we can reach them. Through this door, Signora," added Ludovico, holding down the lamp. "Take care, here are 2 steps." Emily followed, trembling still more than before. She had understood that her escape from the castle depended upon the present moment, while Dupont supported her and endeavored, as they passed along, to cheer her spirits. "Speak low, Signor," said Ludovico. "These passages send echoes all around the castle." "Take care of the light," cried Emily. "You go so fast that the air will extinguish it." Ludovico now opened another door, where they found Annette, and the party then descended a short flight of steps into a passage which, Ludovico said, led around the inner court of the castle and opened into the outer one. As they advanced, confused and tumultuous sounds that seemed to come from the inner court alarmed Emily. "Nay, Signora," said Ludovico, "our only hope is in that tumult. While the signor's people are busied about the men who are just arrived, we may perhaps pass unnoticed through the gates. But hush, he added, as they approached the small door that opened into the outer court. If you will remain here a moment, I will go to see whether the gates are open and anybody is in the way. Pray extinguish the light, signor, if you hear me talking, continued Ludovico, delivering the lamp to Dupont, and remain quite still. Saying this, he stepped out upon the court, and they closed the door, listening anxiously to his departing steps. No voice, however, was heard in the court which he was crossing, though a confusion of many voices yet issued from the inner one. "We shall soon be beyond the walls," said Dupont softly to Emily. "Support yourself a little longer, madame, and all will be well." But soon they heard Ludovico speaking loud, and the voice also of some other person, and Dupont immediately extinguished the lamp. "Ah, it is too late!" exclaimed Emily. "What is to become of us?" They listened again, and then perceived that Ludovico was talking with a sentinel, whose voices were heard also by Emily's favorite dog that had followed her from the chamber, and now barked loudly. "This dog will betray us," said Dupont. "I will hold him." "I fear he has already betrayed us," replied Emily. Dupont, however, caught him up, and again listening to what was going on without, they heard Ludovico say, "I'll watch the gates the while." "Stay a minute," replied the sentinel, "and you need not have the trouble, for the horses will be sent round to the outer stables, then the gates will be shut, and I can leave my post." "I don't mind the trouble, comrade," said Ludovico. "You will do such another good turn for me sometime. Go and fetch some wine. The rogues that are just come in will drink it all, else—" The soldier hesitated, and then called aloud to the people in the second court to know why they did not send out the horses, that the gates must be shut. But they were too much engaged to attend to him, even if they had heard his voice. "Aye, said Ludovico. "They know better than that. They are sharing it all among them. If you wait till the horses come out, you must wait till the wine is drunk. I have had my share already, but since you do not care about yours, I see no reason why I should not have that too." Hold, not so fast," cried the sentinel. "Do watch then for a moment. I'll be with you presently." "Don't hurry yourself," said Ludovico coolly. "I have kept guard before now. But you may leave me your horn, that if the castle should be attacked, you know, I may be able to defend the pass like a hero." "There, my good fellow," returned the soldier. "There, take it. It has seen service, though it could do little in defending the castle. I'll tell you a good story, though, about this same horn." "You'll tell it better when you have had some wine," said Ludovico. "There, they are coming out from the court already." "I'll have some wine, though," said the sentinel, running off. "I won't keep you a minute." "Take your time, I'm in no haste," replied Ludovico, who was already hurrying across the court, when the soldier came back. "Whither so fast, friend? Whither so fast?" said the latter. "What, is this the way you keep watch? I must stand to my post myself, I see." "Aye, well," replied Ludovico, "you have saved me the trouble of following you further, for I wanted to tell you, if you have a mind to drink the Tuscany wine, you must go to Sebastian. He is dealing it out. The other that Frederico has is not worth having. But you are not likely to have any, I see, for they are all coming out." "By St. Peter, so they are," said the soldier, and ran off again, while Ludovico, once more at liberty, hastened to the door of the passage, where Emily was sinking under the anxiety this long discourse had occasioned. But, on his telling them the court was clear, they followed him to the gates, without waiting another instant, yet not before he had seized 2 horses that had strayed from the second court, and were picking a scanty meal among the grass which grew between the pavement of the first. They passed without interruption the dreadful gates, and took the road that led down among the woods. Emily, Monsieur Dupont, and Annette on foot, and Ludovico, who was mounted on one horse, leading the other. Having reached them, they stopped, while Emily and Annette were placed on horseback with their 2 protectors, when, Ludovico leading the way, they set off as fast as the broken road and the feeble light which a rising moon threw among the foliage would permit. Emily was so much astonished by this sudden departure that she scarcely dared to believe herself awake, and she yet much doubted whether this adventure would terminate in escape, a doubt which had too much probability to justify it, for before they quitted the woods they heard shouts in the wind, and, on emerging from them, saw lights moving quickly near the castle above. Dupont whipped his horse, and with some difficulty compelled him to go faster. "Ah, poor beast," said Ludovico, "he is wearied enough. He has been out all day. But, signor, we must fly for it now, for yonder lights are coming this way." Having given his own horse a lash, they now both set off at a full gallop, and when they again looked back, the lights were so distant as scarcely to be discerned, and the voices were sunk into silence. The travellers then abated their pace, and consulting whither they should direct their course, it was determined they should descend into Tuscany and endeavour to reach the Mediterranean, where they could readily embark for France. Thither Dupont meant to attend Emily, if he should learn that the regiment he had accompanied into Italy was returned to his native country. They were now in the road which Emily had travelled with Ugo and Bertrand. But Ludovico, who was the only one of the party acquainted with the passes of these mountains, said that a little further on, a by-road branching from this would lead them down into Tuscany with very little difficulty, and that, at a few leagues' distance, was a small town where necessities could be procured for their journey. "But I hope," added he, "we shall meet with no straggling parties of banditti. Some of them are abroad, I know. However, I have got a good trombone, which will be of some service, if we should encounter any of those brave spirits." Reader's note: when the horn was first mentioned, an obscure word was used to describe it, after which it seems to be being described as a trombone, so I will use the word trombone instead of horn. "You have no arms, signor?" "Yes," replied Dupont. "I have the villain's stiletto who would have stabbed me. But let us rejoice in our escape from Udolpho, nor torment ourselves with looking out for dangers that may never arrive." The moon was now risen high over the woods that hung upon the sides of the narrow glen through which they wandered, and afforded them light sufficient to distinguish their way, and to avoid the loose and broken stones that frequently crossed it. They now travelled leisurely and in profound silence, for they had scarcely yet recovered from the astonishment into which this sudden escape had thrown them. Emily's mind, especially, was sunk, after the various emotions it had suffered, into a kind of musing stillness, which the reposing beauty of the surrounding scene and the creeping murmur of the night breeze among the foliage above contributed to prolong. She thought of Valancourt and of France with hope, and she would have thought of them with joy, had not the first events of this evening harassed her spirits too much to permit her now to feel so lively a sensation. Meanwhile, Emily was alone the object of Dupont's melancholy consideration. Yet, with the despondency he suffered, as he mused on his recent disappointment, was mingled a sweet pleasure, occasioned by her presence, though they did not now exchange a single word. Annette thought of this wonderful escape, of the bustle in which Montoni and his people must be now that their flight was discovered, of her native country whither she hoped she was returning, and of her marriage to Ludovico, to which there no longer appeared to be any impediment, for poverty she did not consider such. Ludovico, on his part, congratulated himself on having rescued his Annette and Signora Emily from the danger that had surrounded them, on his own liberation from people whose manners he had long detested, on the freedom he had given to Monsieur Dupont, on his prospect of happiness with the object of his affections, and not a little on the address with which he had deceived the sentinel and conducted the whole of this affair. Thus variously engaged in thought, the travelers passed on silently for above an hour, a question only being now and then asked by Dupont concerning the road, or a remark uttered by Annette respecting objects seen imperfectly in the twilight. At length lights were perceived twinkling on the side of a mountain, and Ludovico had no doubt that they proceeded from the town he had mentioned, while his companions, satisfied by this assurance, sunk again into silence. Annette was the first who interrupted this. "Holy Peter," said she, "what shall we do for money on our journey? For I know neither I nor my lady have a single sequin. The Signor took care of that." This remark produced a serious enquiry, which ended in as serious an embarrassment, for Dupont had been rifled of nearly all his money when he was taken prisoner. The remainder he had given to the sentinel, who had enabled him occasionally to leave his prison chamber. And Ludovico, who had for some time found a difficulty in procuring any part of the wages due to him, had now scarcely cash sufficient to procure necessary refreshment at the first town in which they should arrive. Their poverty was the more distressing since it would detain them among the mountains where, even in a town, they could scarcely consider themselves safe from Montoni. The travelers, however, had only to proceed and dare the future, and they continued their way through lonely wilds and dusky valleys, where the overhanging foliage now admitted and then excluded the moonlight, wilds so desolate that they appeared on first glance as if no human being had ever trod them before. Even the road in which the party were did but slightly contradict this error, for the high grass and other luxuriant vegetation with which it was overgrown told how very seldom the foot of a traveler had passed it. At length, from a distance, was heard the faint tinkling of a sheep bell, and soon after the bleat of flocks, and the party then knew that they were near some human habitation, for the light which Ludovico had fancied to proceed from a town had long been concealed by intervening mountains. Cheered by this hope, they quickened their pace along the narrow pass they were winding, and it opened upon one of those pastoral valleys of the Apennines which might be painted for a scene of Arcadia, and whose beauty and simplicity were finely contrasted by the grandeur of the snow-topped mountains above. The morning light, now glimmering in the horizon, showed faintly at a little distance upon the brow of a hill, which seemed to peep from, quote, under the opening eyelids of the morn, end quote, the town they were in search of, and which they soon after reached. It was not without some difficulty that they found there a house which could afford shelter for themselves and their horses, and Emily desired they might not rest longer than was necessary for refreshment. Her appearance excited some surprise, for she was without a hat, having had only time to throw on her veil before she left the castle, a circumstance that compelled her to regret again the want of money, without which it was impossible to procure this necessary article of dress. Ludovico, upon examining his purse, found it even insufficient to supply present refreshment, and Dupont at length ventured to inform the landlord, whose countenance was simple and honest, of their exact situation, and requested that he would assist them to pursue their journey, a purpose which he promised to comply with as far as he was able, when he learned that they were prisoners escaping from Montoni, whom he had too much reason to hate. But though he consented to lend them fresh horses to carry them into the next town, he was too poor himself to trust them with money, and they were again lamenting their poverty, when Ludovico, who had been with his tired horses to the hovel which served for a stable, entered the room, half frantic with joy, in which his auditors soon participated. On removing the saddle from one of the horses, he had found beneath it a small bag, containing no doubt the booty of one of the condottieri, who had returned from a plundering excursion just before Ludovico left the castle, and whose horse, having strayed from the inner court while his master was engaged in drinking, had brought away the treasure which the ruffian had considered the reward of his exploit. On counting over this, Dupont found that it would be more than sufficient to carry them all to France, where he now determined to accompany Emily, whether he should obtain intelligence of his regiment or not. For though he had as much confidence in the integrity of Ludovico as his small knowledge of him allowed, he could not endure the thought of committing her to his care for the voyage, nor perhaps had he resolution enough to deny himself the dangerous pleasure which he might derive from her presence. He now consulted them concerning the seaport to which they should direct their way, and Ludovico, better informed of the geography of the country, said that Leghorn was the nearest port of consequence, which Dupont knew also to be the most likely of any in Italy to assist their plan, since from thence vessels of all nations were continually departing. Thither, therefore, it was determined that they should proceed. Emily, having purchased a little straw hat, such as was worn by the peasant girls of Tuscany, and some other little necessary equipments for the journey, and the travellers, having exchanged their tired horses for others better able to carry them, recommenced their joyous way, as the sun was rising over the mountains, and, after travelling through the romantic country for several hours, began to descend into the Vale of Arno. And here Emily beheld all the charms of sylvan and pastoral landscape united, adorned with the elegant villas of the Florentine nobles, and diversified with the various riches of cultivation. How vivid the shrubs that embowered the slopes, with the woods that stretched amphitheatrically along the mountains, and above all, how elegant the outline of these waving Apennines, now softening from the wildness which their interior regions exhibited. At a distance, in the east, Emily discovered Florence, with its towers rising on the brilliant horizon, and its luxuriant plain spreading to the feet of the Apennines, speckled with gardens and magnificent villas, or colored with groves of orange and lemon, with vines, corn, and plantations of olives and mulberry. While to the west the vale opened to the waters of the Mediterranean, so distant that they were known only by a bluish line that appeared upon the horizon, and by the light marine vapor which just stained the ether above. With a full heart, Emily hailed the waves that were to bear her back to her native country, the remembrance of which, however, brought with it a pang, for she had there no home to receive, no parents to welcome her, but was going like a forlorn pilgrim to weep over a sad spot where he who was her father lay interred. Nor were her spirits cheered when she considered how long it would probably be before she would see Valancourt, who might be stationed with his regiment in a distant part of France, and that, when they did meet, it would be only to lament the successful villainy of Montoni. Yet, still she would have felt inexpressible delight at the thought of being once more in the same country with Valancourt, had it even been certain that she could not see him. The intense heat, for it was now noon, obliged the travelers to look for a shady recess where they might rest for a few hours, and the neighboring thickets, abounding with wild grapes, raspberries, and figs, promised them grateful refreshment. Soon after they turned from the road into a grove whose thick foliage entirely excluded the sunbeams, and where a spring, gushing from the rock, gave coolness to the air, and having alighted and turned the horses to graze, Annette and Ludovico ran to gather fruit from one of the surrounding thickets, of which they soon returned with an abundance. The travelers, seated under a shade of a pine and cypress grove and on turf, enriched with such a profusion of fragrant flowers as Emily had scarcely ever seen, even among the Pyrenees, took their simple repast, and viewed with new delight, beneath the dark umbrage of gigantic pines, the glowing landscape stretching to the sea. Emily and Dupont gradually became thoughtful and silent, but Annette was all joy and loquacity, and Ludovico was gay, without forgetting the respectful distance which was due to his companions. The repast being over, Dupont recommended Emily to endeavor to sleep during these sultry hours, and, desiring the servants would do the same, said he would watch the while. But Ludovico wished to share him this trouble. But Ludovico wished to spare him this trouble, and Emily and Annette, wearied with traveling, tried to repose, while he stood guard with his trombone. When Emily, refreshed by slumber, awoke, she found the sentinel asleep on his post, and Dupont awake, but lost in melancholy thought. As the sun was yet too high to allow them to continue their journey, and as it was necessary that Ludovico, after the toils and trouble he had suffered, should finish his sleep, Emily took this opportunity of inquiring by what accident Dupont became Montoni's prisoner, and he, pleased with the interest this enquiry expressed, and with the excuse it gave him for talking to her of himself, immediately answered her curiosity. "I came into Italy, madame," said Dupont, "in the service of my country. In an adventure among the mountains, our party, engaging with the bands of Montoni, was routed, and I, with a few of my comrades, was taken prisoner. When they told me whose captive I was, the name of Montoni struck me, for I remembered that Madame Charon, your aunt, had married an Italian of that name, and that you had accompanied them to Italy. It was not, however, till some time after that I became convinced that this was the same Montoni, or learned that you, madame, was under the same roof with myself. I will not pain you by describing what were my emotions upon this discovery, which I owed to a sentinel, whom I had so far won to my interest that he granted me many indulgences, one of which was very important to me, and somewhat dangerous to himself, but he persisted in refusing to convey any letter or notice of my situation to you, for he justly dreaded a discovery and a consequent vengeance of Montoni. He, however, enabled me to see you more than once. You are surprised, madame, and I will explain myself. My health and spirits suffered extremely from want of air and exercise, and at length I gained so far upon the pity or the avarice of the man that he gave me the means of walking on the terrace." Emily now listened with very anxious attention to the narrative of Dupont, who proceeded: In granting this indulgence, he knew that he had nothing to apprehend from a chance of my escaping from a castle which was vigilantly guarded, and the nearest terrace of which rose over a perpendicular rock, which he showed me also, continued Dupont. A door concealed in the cedar wainscot of the apartment where I was confined, which he instructed me how to open, and which, leading into a passage formed within the thickness of a wall that extended far along the castle, finally opened in an obscure corner of the eastern rampart. I have since been informed that there are many passages of the same kind concealed within the prodigious walls of that edifice, and which were, undoubtedly, contrived for the purpose of facilitating escapes in time of war. Through this avenue, at the dead of night, I often stole to the terrace, where I walked with utmost caution, lest my steps should betray me to the sentinels on duty in distant parts. For this end of it, being guarded by the high buildings, was not watched by the soldiers. In one of my midnight wanderings, I saw light in a casement that overlooked the rampart, and which, I observed, was immediately over my prison chamber. It occurred to me that you might be in that apartment, and, with the hope of seeing you, I placed myself opposite to the window. Emily, remembering the figure that had formerly appeared on the terrace, and which had occasioned her so much anxiety, exclaimed, "It was you, then, Monsieur Dupont, who occasioned me such foolish terror. My spirits were, at that time, so much weakened by long suffering, that they took alarm at every hint." Dupont, after lamenting that he had occasioned her any apprehension, added, "As I rested on the wall opposite your casement, the consideration of your melancholy situation and of my own called from me involuntary sounds of lamentation, which drew you, I fancy, to the casement. I saw there a person whom I believed to be you. Oh, I will say nothing of my emotion at that moment. I wished to speak, but prudence restrained me, till the distant footstep of a sentinel compelled me suddenly to quit my station. It was some time before I had another opportunity of walking, for I could only leave my prison when it happened to be the turn of one man to guard me. Meanwhile, I became convinced from some circumstances related by him that your apartment was over mine, and when I again ventured forth, I returned to your casement, where again I saw you, but without daring to speak. I waved my hand, and suddenly you appeared. Then it was that I forgot my prudence, and yielded to lamentation. Again you appeared. You spoke. I heard the well-known accent of your voice, and at that moment my discretion would have forsaken me again, had I not heard the approaching footsteps of a soldier, when I instantly quitted the place, though not before the man had seen me. He followed down the terrace, and gained so fast upon me that I was compelled to make use of a stratagem, ridiculous enough, to save myself. I had heard of the superstition of many of these men, and I uttered a strange noise with a hope that my pursuer would mistake it for something supernatural and desist from pursuit. Luckily for myself, I succeeded. The man, it seems, was subject to fits, and the terror he suffered threw him into one, by which accident I secured my retreat. A sense of the danger I had escaped, and the increased watchfulness which my appearance had occasioned among the sentinels, deterred me ever from walking the terrace. But, in the stillness of the night, I frequently beguiled myself with an old lute procured for me by a soldier, which I sometimes accompanied with my voice, and sometimes, I will acknowledge, with a hope of making myself heard by you. But it was only a few evenings ago that this hope was answered. I then thought I heard a voice on the wind calling me, yet, even though I feared to reply, lest the sentinel at the prison door should hear me, was I right, madame, in this conjecture? Was it you who spoke? Yes, said Emily with an involuntary sigh. You were right indeed. Dupont, observing the painful emotions which this question revived, now changed the subject. In one of my excursions through the passage which I have mentioned, I overheard a singular conversation, said he. In the passage, said Emily with surprise. "I heard it in the passage," said Dupont, "but it proceeded from an apartment adjoining the wall, within which the passage wound, and the shell of the wall there was so thin, and also somewhat decayed, that I could distinctly hear every word spoken on the other side. It happened that Montoni and his companions were assembled in the room, and Montoni began to relate the extraordinary history of a lady, his predecessor in the castle. He did indeed mention some very surprising circumstances, and whether they were strictly true, his conscience must decide. I fear it will determine against him. But you, madame, have doubtless heard the report which he designs should circulate on the subject of that lady's mysterious fate?" "I have, sir," replied Emily, "and I perceive that you doubt it?" "I doubted it before the period I am speaking of," rejoined Dupont, "but some circumstances mentioned by Montoni greatly contributed to my suspicions. The account I then heard almost convinced me that he was a murderer. I trembled for you, the more so that I had heard the guest mention your name in a manner that threatened your repose, and knowing that the most impious men are often the most superstitious, I determined to try whether I could not awaken their consciences, and awe them from the commission of the crime I dreaded. I listened closely to Montoni, and, in the most striking passages of his story, I joined my voice and repeated his last words in a disguised and hollow tone." "But were you not afraid of being discovered?" said Emily. "I was not," replied Dupont, "for I knew that if Montoni had been acquainted with the secret of this passage, he would not have confined me in the apartment to which it led. I also knew from better authority that he was ignorant of it." The party for some time appeared inattentive to my voice, but at length were so much alarmed that they quitted the apartment, and having heard Montoni's order to his servants to search it, I returned to my prison, which was very distant from this part of the passage. "I remember perfectly to have heard of the conversation you mentioned," said Emily. "It spread a general alarm amongst Montoni's people, and I will own I was weak enough to partake of it." Monsieur Dupont and Emily thus continued to converse of Montoni, and then of France, and then of the plan of their voyage, when Emily told him that it was her intention to retire to a convent in Languedoc, where she had been formerly treated with much kindness, and from thence to write to her relation Monsieur Quesnel and inform him of her conduct. There she designed to wait till La Vallée should again be her own, whither she hoped her income would at some time permit her to return, for Dupont now taught her to expect that the estate of which Montoni had attempted to defraud her was not irrecoverably lost, and he again congratulated her on her escape from Montoni, who, he had not a doubt, meant to have her detained for life. The possibility of recovering her aunt's estates for Valancourt and herself lighted up a joy in Emily's heart, such as she had not known for many months, but she endeavoured to conceal this from Monsieur Dupont, lest it should lead him to a painful remembrance of his rival. They continued to converse till the sun was declining in the west, when Dupont awoke Ludovico, and they set forward on their journey. Gradually descending the lower slopes of the valley, they reached the Arno, and wound along its pastoral margin for many miles, delighted with the scenery around them, and with remembrances which its classic waves revived. At a distance they heard the gay song of peasants among the vineyards, and observed the setting sun tint the waves with yellow lustre, and twilight draw a dusky purple over the mountains, which at length deepened into night. Then the Lucciola, the firefly of Tuscany, was seen to flash its sudden sparks among the foliage, while the cicala, with its shrill note, became more clamorous than even during the noonday heat, loving best the hour when the English beetle, with less offensive sound, quote, winds his small but sullen horn, as oft he rises midst the twilight path against the pilgrim borne in heedless hum." Collins. The travelers crossed the Arno by moonlight at a ferry, and, learning that Pisa was a distance only a few miles down the river, they wished to have proceeded thither in a boat, but, as none could be procured, they set out on their wearied horses for that city. As they approached it, the vale expanded into a plain, variegated with vineyards, corn, olives, and mulberry groves, but it was late before they reached its gates, where Emily was surprised to hear the busy sound of footsteps and the tones of musical instruments, as well as to see the lively groups that filled the streets, and she almost fancied herself again at Venice. But there was no moonlight sea, no gay gondolas dashing the waves, no Palladian palaces to throw enchantment over the fancy and lead it into the wilds of a fairy story. The Arno rolled through the town, but no music trembled from balconies over its waters. It gave only the busy voices of sailors on board vessels just arrived from the Mediterranean, the melancholy heaving of the anchor, and the shrill boatswain's whistle, sounds which since that period have there sunk almost into silence. They then served to remind Dupont that it was probable he might hear of a vessel sailing soon to France from this port, and thus be spared the trouble of going to Leghorn. As soon as Emily had reached the inn, he went therefore to the quay to make inquiries, but after all the endeavours of himself and Ludovico, they could hear of no bark destined immediately for France, and the travellers returned to their resting place. Here also Dupont endeavoured to learn where his regiment then lay, but could acquire no information concerning it. The travellers retired early to rest after the fatigues of this day, and on the following rose early, and without pausing to view the celebrated antiquities of the place, or the wonders of its hanging tower, pursued their journey in the cooler hours through a charming country rich with wine and corn and oil. The Apennines, no longer awful or even grand, here softened into the beauty of sylvan and pastoral landscape, and Emily, as she descended them, looked down delighted on Leghorn, with its spacious bay, filled with vessels and crowned with these beautiful hills. She was no less surprised and amused upon entering this town to find it crowded with persons in the dresses of all nations, a scene which reminded her of a Venetian masquerade, such as she had witnessed at the time of Carnival. But here was bustle without gaiety, and noise instead of music, while elegance was to be looked for only in the waving outlines of the surrounding hills. Monsieur Dupont, immediately on their arrival, went down to the quay, where he heard of several French vessels, and of one that was to sail in a few days for Marseilles, and from whence another vessel could be procured without difficulty to take them across the Gulf of Lyons towards Narbonne, on the coast, not many leagues from which city he understood the convent was seated to which Emily wished to retire. He therefore immediately engaged with the captain to take them to Marseilles, and Emily was delighted to hear that her passage to France was secured. Her mind was now relieved from the terror of pursuit, and the pleasing hope of soon seeing her native country, that country which held Valancourt, restored to her spirits a degree of cheerfulness such as she had scarcely known since the death of her father. At Leghorn also Dupont heard of his regiment, and that it had embarked for France, a circumstance which gave him great satisfaction, for he could now accompany Emily thither without reproach to his conscience or apprehension of displeasure from his commander. During these days he scrupulously forbore to distress her by a mention of his passion, and she was compelled to esteem and pity, though she could not love him. He endeavored to amuse her by showing the environs of the town, and they often walked together on the seashore and on the busy quay, where Emily was frequently interested in the arrival and departure of vessels, participating in the joy of meeting friends, and sometimes shedding a sympathetic tear to the sorrow of those that were separating. It was after having witnessed a scene of this latter kind that she arranged the following stanzas. The Mariner. Soft came the breath of spring, smooth flowed the tide, and blue the heaven in its mirror smiled. The white sail trembled, swelled, expanded wide, the busy sailors at the anchor toiled. With anxious friends that shed the parting tear, the deck was thronged. How swift the moments fly! The vessel heaves, the farewell signs appear. Mute is each tongue, and eloquent each eye. The last dread moment comes. The sailor youth hides the big drop, then smiles amid his pain, soothes his sad bride, and vows eternal truth. Farewell, my love, we shall meet again. Long on the stern with waving hand he stood. The crowded shore sinks lessening from his view as gradual glides the bark along the flood. His bride is seen no more. Adieu, adieu. The breeze of eve moans low, her smile is o'er, dim steals her twilight down the crimsoned west. He climbs the topmost mast to seek once more the far-seen coast, where all his wishes rest. He views its dark line on the distant sky, and fancy leads him to his little home. He sees his weeping love, he hears her sigh, he soothes her griefs and tells of joys to come. Eve yields to night, the breeze to wintry gales. In one vast shade the seas and shores repose. He turns his aching eyes, his spirit fails, the chill tear falls. Sad to the deck he goes. The storm of midnight swells, the sails are furled, deep sounds the lead, but finds no friendly shore. Fast o'er the waves the wretched bark is hurled. "O Ellen, Ellen, we must meet no more." Lightnings that show the vast and foamy deep, the rending thunders as they onward roll, the loud, loud winds that o'er the billows sweep, shake the firm nerve, appall the bravest soul. Ah, what avails the seaman's toiling care? The straining cordage bursts, the mast is riven, the sounds of terror groan along the air, then sink afar. The bark on rocks is driven. Fierce o'er the wreck the whelming waters passed, the helpless crew sunk in roaring main. Henry's faint accents trembled in the blast. "Farewell, my love, we ne'er shall meet again." Oft at the calm and silent evening hour, when summer breezes linger on the wave, a melancholy voice is heard to pour its lonely sweetness o'er poor Henry's grave. And oft at midnight airy strains are heard around the grove where Ellen's form is laid, nor is the dirge by village maidens feared, for lovers' spirits guard the holy shade. End of Volume 3, Chapter 9. Reading and musical selections performed by Kara Dahl Russell.